Hello and welcome. I apologize, I'm just using my computer mic for this recording, so things may sound a little different. There may be some very loud clicking that happens in the middle of the tutorial. So what we're going to focus on for this is we're going to be introducing lights and cameras and things like that. Now in the past, when Cinema4D had the standard render engine be the default, the way I had set the tutorials up the last time I did this run, I didn't really introduce rendering until a later one because we didn't really talk about it. We just looked at how lights and cameras go. But now Redshift is the default render engine for Cinema4D. And you need to make sure that you have that's installed and updated. If you're on the Mac, you can go up to the Spotlight search and open up your Maxon app, or you can just find it wherever it is on in your operating system, right? And if I wait a second for this Maxon app to load, right? I do actually have an update. I'm not going to update it right now, but I do have an update for Redshift. Make sure that you have installed that. I'm not sure, even though it's like defaulting to using Redshift, I'm not sure if it's installing it automatically when you install Cinema now, because the newest version is when it defaulted to that. And I had Redshift installed already, so I'm not sure if it just saw Redshift and was like, oh, we'll use this as the default, or if it's part of the installation process. But yeah, make sure it's installed and updated. Close Cinema, reopen Cinema, and Redshift should be integrated in there. Okay, once you've done all of that, we will start this tutorial. So we're going to just start with the cup. And just a cup in empty space isn't exactly the most exciting thing ever. And so, right, up until this point in the tutorial series, we've just been focusing on modeling and getting objects made in our viewport. What we need to do now is we need to look at, well, how do we get this out into the world, right? How do we take what we've done here, maybe apply materials, and then do the process called rendering, which is basically when and what a render engine does is it simulates, lights and cameras. And so you can imagine there are lights in the scene. The light shines on an object, just like in the real world. The light hits that object, bounces off, and comes into the camera, right? And it's basically the exact same process as our eye functions. Except we can render the world instantaneously. But right, the computer has to simulate this, and it has to simulate light rays going down, hitting an object, bouncing around the scene, and then some of those light rays coming back to the camera. And so that is a expensive process in terms of computation. So what we're going to do is we are going to start looking at these things all in one. Now, the first step is if I want to render this into the viewport, I can do that by just hitting Command or Control R. And you'll see there's like down at the bottom corner, it says viewport rendering. And then the view looks like this, right? My cup has no material on it. It's just white, kind of grayish on an empty infinite void, right? This is a very lonely, solitary cup. There's nothing else around here. This isn't just like a black backdrop. It literally means that in terms of Cinema4D's world, basically into infinity, there is emptiness all around this cup. So we need to add some more things in here to get this to work. Now, rendering to the viewport is fine, but generally the viewport actually has a pretty high pixel count, right, on modern monitors that have high density screens. And so it takes a while, and it's not very fluid. Now, Cinema for Redshift has a much better system. And so if I go up to this little, there's these three icons here for rendering. And so there's render to the viewport, there's render to picture viewer, and edit render settings. If I click on the middle one and hold, you'll see there's this RS render view. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. Now, if for some reason nothing looks like this when you do this, it looks different in some fundamental way, you're probably still on the standard render engine. And the way you would change that is you go to the Edit Render Settings. You just click on it once. And up here, right at the top, it says Renderer, and there's Redshift, Standard, Physical, and Viewport Renderer. We're just going to be focusing, we want to be using Redshift. So yeah, so make sure that you have that selected, and then you should be able to open up the Redshift Renderview and have this go. Now, yours may be totally black right now. It may have nothing in it. What you need to do to get this thing rolling is there's two options. There's this render option here, which will just render an individual frame, right? And it'll render it basically to, I don't know if you saw kind of that flickeriness that was happening there when I did that, but it'll render it to the to full quality. The other option is this start-stop IPR, and what that does is basically it's a progressive render version of this. And so what the progressive render means is that instead of drawing part of it and then part of it and then part of it, and then where most render engines will work in chunks, and they'll do like a chunk at a time across this, so you can't really see the full scene until that's all those chunks are done. The way a progressive render engine works is that it does a really crappy job and for the whole scene, and it'll render a whole bunch of passes, and you'll see this progressive rendering bar down here, and it's saying it's 95% complete or whatever. If you look in the render settings for Redshift, so if I select this, I've got this set, and I actually select Redshift here, and I'm in the advanced. I'm going to go back to basic because this just kind of shows us what's going on. If I go to basic settings, you'll see the progressive passes are 1024. So when this thing gets to 100%, it's done 1024 passes to clean this image up. So what's nice about progressive rendering is that if I am working on lighting and I'm adjusting settings, or I'm adjusting the position of the camera or whatever, it updates in reasonably real time. So if I come over to my viewport with this still floating here, and I hold down, say, 3 so I can orbit around my object, right? Oops, I grabbed it instead, right? But you can see that this is updating pretty much in real time, and this is really, really handy. It allows us to make changes on the fly, whereas like adjusting lighting, especially in a complex scene in the old version, you'd have to like wait to see if it's done, and sometimes those renders take a long time. So this is a really good system. Now, one of the issues here is, right, it's kind of annoying that you have this window that's free floating in front. And it'd be great if we could actually integrate this into our system. There's a bunch of other settings here we're not really going to talk about at this point, but we will get through those as we go through the class. We'll introduce more of the things that are set up here. So temporarily, I'm going to stop the IPR. Something to note, if you have IPR going, sometimes it will make your system lag some, especially if you have more complex models. So that's something where, right, you may want to pause it and start it based on what you're doing, but it's still far more efficient than the old system. Okay, so what we want to do is it'd be great if this was a pane inside the main cinema window. I'm going to go ahead and close this render view for the time being so we can see the window, and I'm going to close the render settings as well. So, right, we have all of these different, right, layouts that are slightly different, and it'd be nice if we had one for Redshift. Now, I've already got one set for Redshift, but I'm going to go ahead and make a new one so that we can see this. So we're going to start with our standard pane, and what we're going to do is we're going to come up and we're going to come here. We're going to say Redshift Renderview, and then there's these horizontal lines here. If I click and drag, you'll see that I start to get these highlighted gray lines. What that means is that I can put this viewport render, or this render view, I can attach it in any of these places. Now, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and attach it to the bottom, of my main viewport. So I'm going to go ahead and do this, right? And I'm going to pull this up. There's a bunch of unfortunate information here that I would like to hide, but I cannot. And maybe there's a setting where I can just turn that off. And I want you to note this looks terrible. And that's just because it's taking whatever that last image was and it's trying to redraw it. If we hit play again, it'll clean up immediately. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this. And so now we've got our render view in here. If it makes more sense for this to be somewhere else, you can always just grab, right, this thing, and you can be like, oh, maybe it's better on the side, right? Maybe that's a better option, and gives me the ability to see these things more clearly. And it really just depends on what seems to work best for your current system. Now note, if it covers up some of the icons up here, we haven't talked about this yet, but if icons up here are covered up, you can just you can right click and slide these over, or use 2 fingers on your trackpad, and you can actually go ahead and get this over and access the things that are missing. The same is not necessarily true for this viewport. There's settings beyond here that the only way I can make accessible, unfortunately, is by just continuing to stretch this window out and make it larger, right? But we don't need really any of those right now. So we're just going to go ahead and leave that closed. So then how do we save this so we don't have to do this every single time we want to use Redshift? So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here to these 3 dots, and we're going to go to Save Layout As. And so I'm going to go over here and note that there's all these weird characters at the front. That basically is like where should this go in the order that we've got these things, right? And so if I set it to, 0, 0, that's going to be here. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So since it starts numbering at 0, this last one is 8. So I should make this one 9. And I'm going to say this will be 9. And then I'm going to call this Redshift. And I'm going to call it something slightly different. I'm going to call it Redshifty because I already have Redshift as 1. And you can actually see it here in my in the place it's saving it. Just let it save it wherever it wants to save it. It's very specific in terms of where it's going to be looking for these. So save it here. So now I have Redshifty. Right? And so I can go from Redshifty, I can go to standard. And I want you to note it's in italics. That just means it's one that you created rather than one of the default ones. So I've got Redshifty, and I'm ready to go. Okay, so let's go ahead and add some things to this scene so we can start to see what's going to happen. So the first thing we're going to look at are lights. But in order for us to understand what lights are going to do, we are going to need another object. So I'm going to need to put a plane in here. And for some reason, I think those are on the same plane. Let's see. But we just need to make our plane really large. Did I move my cup substantially? It looks like I might have. So you can see this is all like really scrunched over here. So I'm going to pull this out a little bit. And I'm just going to fix, oh yeah, that's really off. I must have selected something. I'm just going to say, something we haven't talked about is if you select the R, the S, or the P on here, if you click on that, if I just click on the X, it's just going to select one of these. But if I click on the P, it'll select all 3. And if I right click, I can just say reset all, and it'll put it right back at the center of the world, which is pretty fantastic, right? Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and take my plane. And the reason we want a plane is because, right, we want to be able to have something that shadows are being cast on. So we can see how lights function and differences in types of light. So I've made a plane that's reasonably large. So now I need to create a light. And so to create lights in Cinema4D, what you do is you come down to these options here. You can see this is sun and sky rig. We're not going to talk about that right now. This is the cameras menu, and then this is the different types of light. If I click and hold, you'll see area light is the default. That is definitely the most common light type that's used, and there's reasons for that, and it's mainly because it's generally the most physically accurate. But there's also point light, spotlight, infinite light. There's a dome light, and IES light, which is very particular. We're not going to worry about that one for this class, most likely. There's a portal light or a physical sun. And so we're going to start with the point light, and we're going to really be focusing on the point light and the area light and look at the difference between the two. So if I choose a point light, everything goes instantly black, right? There is no light whatsoever in the scene, and there's a couple reasons for this. So first, the reason there was light before we had our lights on is because there is what's called a default light. And you can think of the default light as a light that would be, if we're looking through a camera, imagine there's like a light that's mounted, a light kit that's mounted to the camera. So we're basically getting a light from the point of view of the camera on the scene. And usually that light doesn't have shadows, it doesn't, right, it just illuminates objects. And so you can see stuff while you're working on things without any lights or anything in your scene. And that's just part of the thing. But now we don't have a default light. And so one of the issues is that our current light is at 0, 0, 0, right? It's intersecting the mug, it's intersecting everything else, and right, light's not going to pass through those surfaces. So I'm going to lift the light up higher, and you can see the icon now. It's this little sparkly looking thing, but still absolutely no light. So let's go ahead and select our light in our hierarchy. And once we've selected the light in our hierarchy, we can come down here and we're going to start messing with some of these settings. Now, note the type is point. We can actually we can switch the type of the light here, which is pretty fantastic. There's this option to add a graph. We're not going to talk about that yet. That's a little bit more advanced, but allows really cool things to happen. And we don't need to worry about any of these other settings here. But what we do need to worry about right now is our intensity and our exposure. So intensity has a huge range of values, and it's the intensity of the light. And right, lights can vary in intensity greatly. We can have a very dim, like candlelight or Christmas lights, or right, something, or a small LED on a circuit board or something like that. Or we can have the sun, which will like burn your eyes out, right? There's a huge range of intensity, or lasers or something like that, right? There's a huge range of intensity of light. And so so this slider, if I crank this thing way up, I want you to note that it starts to get this sphere, which kind of shows some of the fall off and how much intensity it has. And you can see I can go up to 100,000 as the maximum unit of light, and this still isn't isn't super intense. I can also, if I go back down to 100, right, it's totally dark, but if I adjust my exposure, right, I can get a very similar setting. Now, obviously this, I would say, is still not quite right what I would like. And so I'm going to go ahead and increase my intensity some. Notice that as soon as I start increasing the intensity even a little bit, things go really, really sideways. And so the reason they did this intensity and exposure is so that you didn't have to be like, I don't know, it basically makes one of the sliders easier. I usually set this to somewhere where it's like moderate, and then you can tweak and refine here, and you don't have to worry about nudging this over by just a tiny bit. You've got like a lot more freedom here. And so let's go ahead, and so I have this set to 12, 127, and 6.3 more or less, right? So you can get a similar amount of light, and I'm going to make this view a lot bigger. So one of the things with point lights, right? Point lights literally mean light is all emanating from a singular point. So a point light that you may be familiar with is the sun. right? The sun is a point light, and it's not a point, right? The sun is absolutely massive. However, it is so far away that it acts as a point light, right? Because all those beams of light are going in essentially the same direction when they hit the Earth. The sun is so large that it's all that light is essentially collimated aiming at the Earth. There's not a whole lot of spread. And so when there's not a lot of spread in a light source, you get really hard shadows, right? So you could also, like, if there was say a street light that's, 20, 30 feet high, and you're walking underneath it, you might see really hard shadows there as well, because again, it's far enough away and still intense enough that you can, right, that you get hard shadows. Now, an area light is different than that. Let's go ahead and we're going to turn our point light off. And I want you to note, as soon as I do that, right, the default light comes back on. Right? When I have any light in the scene, it's going to be like, oh, I don't need to be on, and it'll turn off. But then it'll turn back on so we can see all of our objects in like really flat light with no shadows, so to speak. So I'm going to go ahead and create an area light now. So I'm just going to go ahead and click once to create the area light. And you'll see, even with the same settings, this intensity of 100 here, and you'll note that it's at the maximum over here, my exposure set to 0, there's already light coming out of this, right? It's filling the cup with light. So let's go ahead and lift our area light up a little bit. And already I want you to notice something about this area light, right? We're getting light that's directional. So the point light is shooting light in all directions. The area light has a very strong plane here that determines which direction the light is coming out. And so we've got light, you can see very clearly we've got light coming in this direction and shadow in that way. If I go over to my viewport and rotate my view a touch, we'll be able to see some of this a little bit better, and I might actually just zoom in on the light itself. So you can kind of see in the viewport we're getting like a preview of what's going on as well. Obviously, it's not as accurate as this, but it's there. So, right, so this is the plane. This is our area. Notice there's these two little orange things here. So I can actually, right, change the shape of this light to match another source, right? So if there were like long fluorescent tubes in a space, I could have 4 of these lights next to each other, right, shining down. If there was a big window, I could use this as a form of light, right, to run through that window. We'll look at, there's other shapes you can make this. You can do all sorts of interesting things with it. The way you know what direction the light is facing is these little lines here basically tell you, 1, that the light is going to be aimed this direction, and 2, the amount of spread that it has, right? Because they're fanned out. If they were straight coming out of these corners perpendicular, then that would mean it was like all the rays there was very little spread. So let's go ahead and rotate our light some. And I'm going to rotate it down so it's casting light on the scene a little bit better. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. And so the first thing I want you to notice that's like the biggest difference between a point light and an area light is how hard the shadows are, right? Because this area light, right, instead of light just coming from one tiny point, I have light coming from, this area light. If I select it and go to the settings here and scroll down, my rectangle is 245 by 200 centimeters, right? This is a big light. So there's light coming from all these points. And it has, the spread is set to 1. So it's spreading as much as it can right now. You might be able to increase the spread beyond that, but right, it's maxed out. And so what that means is those light waves are sort of intersecting, right? So some of them are going to be casting here, but then there's light that's coming down from like slightly different that's going to soften that. There's some of the lights coming from a steeper angle, it's going to come out here, but we're going to get this feathering of these edges that happens, right? Okay, I'm going to go ahead. So now I've got this light, right? And I've got that point light as well. I'm going to go ahead and scoot this thing over a little bit. Oh, yeah. No, I want to go maybe this way. I could probably use a different setting. So I want you to note, right, again, getting it closer or further away is going to adjust that intensity. Also, right, as I said, anything suitably far away is going to have harder shadows. So if I had this area light, and granted, I'm going to pull it pretty far out here. I want you to note that, right, granted, I could increase the intensity, but I'm going to, but these shadows are starting to get significantly harder because that light's further away, so it's acting more like a point source, right? So when you're setting up lights in your scene, one of the things that, and so where's my intensity? I'm just going to increase my exposure some on this light, right? So one of the things that people do a lot when they start is they have all their lights too close to their objects, and they're like, why don't I have any hard shadows? This thing, when I'm trying to recreate this thing, it should have hard shadows or harder shadows. And really, it's just like, how close are your lights to your object, right? The further away they are, the harder those shadows are going to be if you use area lights. And so the, oops, I didn't want to do that. Some of these other lights, these are all similar lights. They're all point source. Infinite light, what this does is it's basically, it acts kind of like the sun or like a light source that's like an infinite distance away. All it is, and I'm going to go ahead and create one now just to show you what it does. Let's go ahead and turn off our area light. And I want you to note that, right, there's light in the scene when I have my infinite light, and it's all coming from one direction. And the way an infinite light works, I'm going to have to move it here and lift it up a little bit and maybe zoom in so we can see a little bit better. Perfect. So the infinite light is, you know, a little light thing, but it has this one ray that comes out in one direction. The only adjustment you need to do to an infinite light, you don't need to move it around the scene at all. I could have left it where it was, is rotation. And so if I want this to be at a, right, to be like it's shining down on the scene, all I need to do is rotate this, right? And as I rotate this view, it's kind of like the light is higher in the sky, right? You can imagine this is like directly, more or less directly above. And you can see in my Redshift Renderview, there's very little shadow there, and I can, you know, have the shadow increase. Note that the shadow is very hard, right? Because this is an infinite light source, so it's a really long way away. And you can see if I flip it all the way upside down, it goes dark, right? You can animate this to do all sorts of, you know, day cycles and things like that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and delete that one, and I'm going to turn the area light and the point light on. Right, and now let's go ahead and adjust our view so we can see this a little bit better. Right, so you can see my point light is, right, directly above the cup and casting that shadow, and it's also really low. So let me go ahead and let's move the point light a little bit higher up. You can see my shadow is going to shrink, and maybe I'll put it this direction so we actually have these two shadows offset. And I'm going to go ahead and increase the, probably the intensity. I'm going to give that intensity a little bit of a boost. And then maybe pull the exposure down just a touch, or maybe boost it. But I want you to note, right, these things are all interacting with each other because they're different lights. Okay, let's look at some of the other settings we can adjust on these lights. We're going to start with the point light. And we're going to go ahead and go down. And the other big setting, we can adjust how the light decays. Decay just means like how does it go from full brightness to no brightness, right? Or full intensity to no intensity. And we're going to leave it at quadratic. You can do linear, you could do none, which basically means it's just going to blast out the scene 100% brightness. You know, as though the light was right on top of everything. So the other settings that are available down here that are important to note are color. So we can choose to just color our lights as though they have like colored gels in front of them. So if I was to say, oh, let's make this a teal light, right? So then this light is teal. What's nice is it shows you by changing the colors of this to let you know which light is which color. And I want you to note, right, because we have these two lights in the scene, it's being pretty washed out, but you can see the teal tint in the render view here. And then anywhere where this light is being completely blocked, we're getting all of that teal fill in that shadow. So if I was to then go to my, say, my RS area light and come down to the same settings, and I could change this to, I don't know, let's do magenta or something. Right? So now you can see that I'm getting magenta in here. This shadow is actually more intensely magenta, right? Because it's, again, the point light is being blocked by the cup. So we're getting the full magenta here, and then we're getting these nice blends across the scene. And so we can start to get things, right, we can make things really intensely colored that way pretty easily. We're going to, the other way we can, the other mode we can work with is color temperature. So I'm going to say go down to color. There's also color and temperature, which is kind of a blend of the two. But I'm going to say we're going to take both of these lights and let's do temperature for both of them. What temperature does is if you haven't heard of color temperature, it's measured in degrees Kelvin, and it doesn't mean it's hot or cold. What it means is it's white light, but is it warm or is it cool? And so sunsets, sunrises, you're going to have very warm white light, right? Very warm. It becomes much more red. But then at, like, say 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that's a much more blue or cool light. And it goes the opposite direction. So 6500 is neutral. And if I was to say, let's say it's, you know, more sunsetty, right? If I go down in temperature, it gets warmer, right? And so this is a mix of these two lights. If I just have the area light on, I'm going to turn the point light off for now, right? You can see that this is much, much warmer. If I keep going, it gets warmer this way. And if I go the other direction, right, it's going to be, you're going to see more blue in that lighting. Now, this is really handy if you are trying to recreate, like, say it's an indoor space with, like, fluorescent lights, and you know, you've looked up, like, what number of degrees Kelvin are your standard fluorescent light. You could input that number, and usually it's like a warmer, I don't know how many degrees. It's usually somewhere around here. And then if you're like, oh, but then there's this light from outside coming in, and I want it to feel like it's the middle of the afternoon, right? I can come onto this other light, and if I turn it on, right, and say, oh, this should be, you know, 8,000 or whatever that sunny afternoon color is, then I'm going to get, and depending on the intensities, you know, which I could adjust, I'm going to get a much more, like, accurate representation of lighting. And I'll have some cooler shadows, some warmer shadows. And it really will make the scene feel more accurate. Okay, so that's kind of the lighting primer. There's there's not a whole lot more to it than this. If we go to our area light, there are a few more settings here. If I scroll down, I can change the area light shape. I can adjust the spread, and I can check mark whether it's visible, bidirectional. You can also normalize the intensity, which we're not going to worry about right now. So if I turn off my point light, and I just have my area light on. I'm not sure why that scene looks so dark. It's probably because it's such a warm color. It's just dim in the viewport. So if I have this set, and I change the shape, notice I can do a disc, a sphere, cylinder, a mesh, right? Any object in the scene I can turn into a light. And so if I was to set this to a disc, it's going to slightly change the lighting quality. And if I change this to a sphere, it's going to slightly change it again. I'm going to go ahead and set this to a disc. And then this visible option, it doesn't mean that light rays are going to be visible in the scene. What it means is that if I zoom out far enough and maybe rotate my view so I can see the front surface, right? So I can actually see the light source I'm going to bring this down a little bit closer, just so we can zoom in a touch and not have the whole thing, right? But so you can see this is my light source. So there's times when, you know, I'm going to want, like, say it's an architectural space and there are can lights in the ceiling, right? I would probably want to have the light be visible so we can see what those sources are for our scene. And you'll note, right, it's flat, it's white, and there's other things we can do to make light rays happen and everything. But, right, having those lights visible is usually a good time. And again, we can adjust the size. Bidirectional just means it's going to be, light will be coming from the front surface and the back surface. That used to be the default for area lights. I'm glad they made it the opposite for this. And then I think that's about all we need to talk about with these lights. You can experiment with the other light types and see how they work. Okay, let's go ahead and we can save our scene at this point. And I'm going to do save as, so it's, there we go, cup light start tutorial, perfect. I'm going to replace it, yes. Okay, so then the next section will actually introduce materials and cameras and how to render out of the scene.